He took my medal, the one I had earned under a burning desert sky, and flung it to the floor as if it were nothing more than a trinket. Then he pressed his shoe down on it, grinding it into the polished wood in front of the entire family. In that instant, something shifted inside me. He thought he had humiliated me. He thought he had silenced me. But what he didn't realize was that moment lit the fuse to a battle no one could have predicted. Before I bring you into this journey, a story of betrayal, resilience, and the kind of honor that no wealth can buy, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here we tell stories that matter, stories of military women who carried both the burden of combat and the weight of injustice at home. Your support helps keep these voices alive. This is not just another tale of a family feud. It is not simply about in-laws, money, or power. It is about the essence of dignity and what it costs to defend it when those closest to you become your fiercest adversaries. For me, honor was never a word I wore on a t-shirt or carved into a plaque. It was the promise I made when I raised my right hand, swore my oath, and stepped into a life where sacrifice was expected, not optional. I had worn the uniform of the United States Navy. I had stood watch on lonely nights, salt air biting at my skin, listening to the hum of the ship as if it were a living thing. I had seen the sea in its violence and in its stillness. I had learned to carry fear in my pocket, quiet and folded small so it would not rule me. I had learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to walk forward anyway. Every stripe, every medal, every scar on my body carried a story. And one of those medals, the one they crushed underfoot, had come at a price that only those who have faced fire can understand. But to them, my husband's family, it was nothing. A piece of metal, an ornament from a life they neither respected nor understood. They came from wealth, the kind that is printed on embossed invitations and whispered in political circles. To them, legacy was measured in stocks and last names. To me, legacy was measured in lives saved and promises kept. That night at their long dining table, with crystal glasses and silver polished bright, they revealed exactly how little my service meant to them. They believed I was beneath them. They believed I could be broken. They were wrong. This story is about what came after that night. The nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how betrayal could cut deeper than any wound on the battlefield. It is about the voices that rose to remind me that I was not alone, that honor was not theirs to give or take. It is about the choice every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine must make at some point. Do I bow to the cruelty of others, or do I stand for the truth, even when standing means standing alone? I want you to hear this story not as gossip from behind closed doors, but as a testament. Because honor is not defined in a courtroom or at a dinner table. It is defined in the quiet places where no one is watching. It is defined in the moment you refuse to be erased, even when powerful hands try to blot you out. So stay with me. In the minutes ahead, I will take you into that world, into the glittering halls of a family who thought their money could rewrite truth, and into the unbreakable resolve of a woman who had walked through war and would not be undone by arrogance. You will see how lies crumble when confronted by courage, how betrayal can spark not destruction, but a renewal of purpose. Because this is not just my fight. It is the fight of every servicewoman who has ever been told she is less. It is the fight of every veteran who came home only to face a different kind of battlefield. And it is the fight of every person who knows that integrity, once given away, can never be reclaimed. What began with a medal shattered on the floor would end with something far greater: the reclaiming of truth, the rebuilding of trust, and the reminder that honor, once tested, burns brighter than ever. This is my story, and it begins here. When I think back to that night, I remember the chandeliers first. The way their light spilled down like waterfalls of fire, dancing over crystal glasses and polished silver. Everything shimmered in that room, everything except me. I was the shadow at the end of the long mahogany table, the outsider dressed in my best navy blue dress, the one I had bought at the base exchange with a month's worth of saved pay. To them, I wasn't just a guest. I was a reminder of something raw, something they could neither buy nor understand. Daniel's family called it a celebration. I called it an inspection. His mother, with her pearls and her smile as sharp as glass, presided over the table like a judge. His father, the patriarch, spoke rarely, but when he did, the weight of his words carried like a gavel. Around them gathered cousins, aunts, uncles, all with names that opened doors in Washington and closed them just as quickly on anyone they deemed unworthy. And me, Maya Collins, Navy petty officer, decorated, battle-tested, and in their eyes an interloper. Have you ever walked into a room and known instantly that you didn't belong? That no matter how you straightened your shoulders, no matter how politely you smiled, you were already dismissed. That was the current I felt pressing against me from the moment I stepped through their carved oak doors. Maybe you've been there too, at a table where the chairs are filled with power, and you are the only one without a crown. At first, the remarks were subtle. The cousin across from me leaned in and asked if I was still working those ships. His tone dripped with mockery, as if the steel hulls that carried America's sons and daughters into danger were nothing but toy boats in a bathtub. A woman at the far end whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "She's pretty, I suppose, but what can she possibly offer Daniel? He could have married anyone." And then came the inevitable line from Daniel's younger brother Oliver, his grin wide, his voice carrying above the clink of glasses. "She's just a sailor. Not really Hale material, is she?" I felt Daniel tense beside me, his hand brushing mine under the table. He didn't speak, though. Not yet. Silence, I realized, was his shield in this family. But silence cuts, doesn't it? Sometimes deeper than words. I wanted to remind them that sailors had stood in the eye of hurricanes, had watched comrades swept overboard and still gone back to stand their watch. I wanted to remind them that I had led a rescue mission in the Gulf of Aden, that the medal pinned on my dress that evening had been earned in fire, not inherited with a last name. But honor, I knew, does not shout. It does not beg to be recognized. It simply exists. Still, the ache of their dismissal pressed heavy on my chest. As the evening wore on, the air thickened. Wine flowed. Stories of business deals and political maneuvering filled the room. No one asked about deployments, about the sound of a flight deck at midnight, or the faces of sailors too young to shave holding rifles in foreign ports. They did not ask because they did not care. Then it happened. Oliver, already emboldened by laughter and wine, reached across the table. His hand snatched at my chest, not at me, but at the medal pinned there. Bronze, burnished by years of touch, the ribbon faded from sun and salt air. It was the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, awarded after a night when we pulled a burning helicopter crew from the wreckage of a crash on the carrier deck. I still smell the smoke sometimes, still hear the screaming. That medal was not decoration. It was memory. Oliver held it up, dangling it between two fingers as though it were a joke from a carnival prize booth. "This," he sneered, "this is what passes for achievement in your world." Before I could react, he dropped it to the floor. And then, slow, deliberate, he ground his polished shoe into it. The sound was small, a metallic scrape against wood. But in my ears, it roared like an explosion. My stomach dropped, my throat burned. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I looked around the table. No one stopped him. His mother's lips curved almost imperceptibly. His father raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Laughter flickered, sharp and cruel. Have you ever felt invisible and blazing all at once? That was me in that second, every nerve on fire. every instinct screaming to act, yet chained by the weight of the room, by the need to keep my composure. Daniel finally stood, his chair scraping back hard against the floor. His voice was low, tight with fury. "Oliver, that's enough." But the damage was done. The metal lay crushed, and with it the last shred of illusion that I could ever belong in that house. I wonder, if it had been you sitting there, what would you have done? Would you have picked it up in silence, dusted it off, swallowed the humiliation? Or would you have slammed your fist on the table, demanded respect no matter the cost? I bent slowly, lifting the metal from the floor. My hands shook, but not from weakness. It was rage, pure and steady, coursing through me. I met Oliver's gaze, and for the first time I let him see it, the steel forged in deployments, the fire of nights when storms threatened to tear ships apart and only sheer will held the crew together. "This," I said quietly, holding up the metal, "was earned in ways you cannot even imagine." The table fell silent. For a heartbeat, I thought perhaps they understood. But then the laughter resumed, softer, behind hands and napkins, like children mocking in a schoolyard. And in that moment, I knew this was not just a family dinner. This was war, and the battlefield stretched far beyond any ocean I had ever sailed. Stay with me, because what came next, how I carried that crushed metal out of their house, how the shadows of betrayal began to spread, was only the beginning. When we left that house later that night, the metal still pressed into my palm, I thought of all the places it had been. It had been pinned to my chest on the flight deck, the air still thick with the smell of burned jet fuel. It had rested against my heart through storms that rocked us until we swore the sea meant to swallow us whole. And now it bore the mark of Oliver's shoe, a scuff line cutting across its bronze face. Isn't it strange how objects hold stories, how something small enough to fit in your hand can carry the weight of nights that nearly broke you? I know some of you listening right now may have your own token, maybe a photograph, a ring, a folded flag that carries more than anyone else could understand. If you do, I hope you hold it close as I speak. Because for me, that medal became more than memory that night. It became a symbol of a battle I never expected to fight. As we stepped outside, the cold air hit my face like a slap. The Hale mansion stood behind us, its windows blazing with light, its walls echoing with laughter that felt like knives. Daniel walked stiffly, his jaw tight, his silence heavier than words. We didn't speak until we reached the car. "Why didn't you stop him sooner?" The question slipped out before I could catch it, my voice raw. Daniel flinched. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "Maya, you know how they are. If I'd pushed harder, it would have only made things worse." "Worse?" I almost laughed. "How could it be worse than watching your honor ground underfoot while the people who claim to be your family sat by in silence?" But I said nothing. I leaned back, clutching the metal, letting the night blur past the window. Here's something I've learned. Silence is its own kind of betrayal. And that night, Daniel's silence cut deeper than Oliver's cruelty. When we got back to our small townhouse, I went straight to the bedroom, pulled open the top drawer of my dresser, and laid the medal inside. My hands lingered on it, tracing the scar it now carried. I whispered a promise to myself. They may have mocked it, but they would never erase what it stood for. Have you ever promised yourself something in the quiet of your room with no one else listening? That's when real vows are made. That's when you decide who you are. The days that followed were a blur of routine. I went to work at the base, trained with my unit, kept my mind sharp. On the outside, I was the same. On the inside, a storm gathered. Every time I looked at the medal, I remembered the smirk on Oliver's face, the cold pride in his mother's eyes, the way laughter filled the room like smoke choking me. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every sailor who had ever bled for that ribbon, every comrade whose name was etched into stone. They had spat not just on me, but on all of us. I began to notice other things, too. The way Daniel's parents spoke to him, not as if he were a man in uniform, but as if he were an extension of their empire. The subtle reminders that his career, his choices, even his marriage were tools in their social arsenal. They had welcomed me not out of love, but because they thought they could bend me. But you can't bend steel that's been through fire. One night, about a week later, Daniel and I were invited back again. I almost refused, but part of me wanted to face them, to show them I wasn't afraid. As we drove up the long, curving driveway lined with manicured hedges, I braced myself. Inside, the atmosphere was the same, polished, perfect, suffocating. But beneath the surface, shadows shifted. This time, the jabs came sharper, more calculated. His mother Evelyn asked me in her clipped tone if I ever felt guilty leaving behind family responsibilities for deployments. His father leaned forward, voice heavy with false concern, and suggested that perhaps the Navy wasn't the right environment for a young woman who wanted stability. And Oliver, always Oliver, smiled as he told the table he'd done some research and discovered that my unit's mission hadn't even made the news. "So how important could it have been?" he asked, smugness dripping from each word. Every sentence was a trap, every glance a test. Have you ever been in a room where you realized the people across from you weren't just talking? They were probing, measuring, plotting. That's what it felt like. A battlefield dressed in satin and silverware. I answered calmly, choosing each word as carefully as if I were disarming a mine. But inside, the storm raged. I thought of Sarah, the widow who told me once, "They will never understand what you carry, but you must carry it anyway." I thought of Cole, who lost his arm yet still saluted with his left hand, reminding us that dignity isn't in limbs but in spirit. And I thought of every young sailor who had looked to me for leadership when the seas rose black and wild. That night when we left, Daniel said softly, "You were incredible in there. You didn't let them win." But the truth, their game wasn't about winning or losing a single dinner. It was about eroding me bit by bit until I broke. And as I closed the door behind me that evening, I realized something chilling. They weren't going to stop. Friends, let me ask you, what would you do if you were married not just to a man, but to a family who saw you as a weakness to exploit? Would you fight back openly, or would you gather your strength in silence, waiting for the right moment? I chose the latter, because war is not fought in a single strike. It is fought in patience, in endurance, in the gathering of proof. As I lay awake that night, Daniel asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling and knew the truth. Their wealth was their weapon, but mine was honor. And honor, once tested, becomes unbreakable. So when you hear me speak of that crushed metal, don't picture defeat. Picture the moment a fire caught spark in the ashes. Picture the beginning of a war not waged on seas or in deserts, but across dinner tables and behind closed doors. A war where the stakes were not territory or power, but dignity itself. And that, right there, was the shadow beneath the chandelier light, the hidden war I had just stepped into. Stay with me, because in the next chapter, you'll see how the scar on that metal became the scar on my soul, and how I found unexpected allies in the places where grief and loyalty meet. And perhaps, as you listen, you'll remember your own battles, the ones no one applauded, the ones fought in silence. Because we all carry wars the world cannot see. I lay awake that night, the house still and Daniel breathing evenly beside me, and I whispered the words I had spoken years ago at Great Lakes during my oath ceremony. "I do solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." My voice shook as I mouthed them, silent in the dark, but the weight of them pressed steady on my chest. Those words had never left me. I had carried them through storm and heat, through loneliness and fear. They had been my compass. But how do you defend yourself when the enemy is not wearing a uniform, not carrying a rifle, but sitting across the table in a silk gown, a glass of wine in her hand, her smile cutting sharper than a blade? How do you hold the line when the battle is fought not on steel decks or foreign soil, but in living rooms and at dinner tables? That was the question clawing at me. Betrayal is a strange wound. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't bruise. It seeps. It seeps into the quiet moments when you're folding laundry or stirring coffee, into the pauses of a conversation, into the silence when you reach for the person you love and they don't reach back. And betrayal by family, by those who should protect rather than destroy, burns hotter than anything I ever felt under fire. Have you ever felt that kind of betrayal? The kind that makes you question not just the people around you, but yourself. If you have, then you know how it lingers, how it whispers in your ear at night, how it makes you wonder if maybe, somehow, you deserved it. I turned back to the medal often in those days. I kept it in my drawer, scuffed and scarred, a daily reminder of what had been done to me. I should have hidden it away, but I couldn't. Because every time I looked at it, I remembered the night of the helicopter fire, remembered the faces streaked with soot, the desperate grip of the crewman whose hand I pulled from the wreckage. That medal was theirs as much as mine, and I would not let Oliver's cruelty erase their sacrifice. Still, the loneliness grew. Daniel tried in his way, but his silence at that table still echoed. At the base, I wore my uniform, smiled at my sailors, and carried on. But inside, I was fraying. That was when Sarah found me. Sarah had been a Marine wife. Her husband, Captain David Ruiz, had been killed in Afghanistan, leaving her with 2 children and a grief that could have drowned her. She lived near the base, in a modest house with a flag always flying out front. I'd seen her before at events, her eyes clear, her presence steady. One afternoon, I ran into her at the commissary. She noticed my tired eyes, the way I clutched my groceries like they might fall if I let go. "You look like you need company," she said gently, and that was how it began. Sarah didn't ask for explanations. She simply opened her door. She cooked too much food, poured strong coffee, and listened. Her children played in the yard, their laughter a balm to the heaviness inside me. Sitting in her kitchen with its mismatched mugs and the smell of cinnamon always lingering, I found something I hadn't felt in months home. She told me once, "They don't have to understand, Maya. They never will. But you know, you were there, you carry it, and that's enough." Her words wrapped around me like a blanket. And then there was Cole. Cole had been a boatswain's mate, broad-shouldered, quick with a grin, until an accident on deployment took his right arm. When I met him, he wore a prosthetic, the metal catching the light as he gestured, but what struck me most was not what he had lost. It was what he refused to surrender. His dignity, his humor, his belief that scars, visible or not, were proof of survival. He saw me one day staring at the medal in my hand. He nodded, slow and certain, and said, "Medals are metal, Collins. Honor is blood. Don't ever confuse the two." I laughed then, the kind of laugh that breaks through tears. And for the first time since that night at the Hale Mansion, I felt like maybe I wasn't broken. Let me ask you something. Do you have people like that in your life? The ones who step in when the people who should have been there vanish. The ones who sit beside you, not needing answers, not demanding explanations, just offering presence. If you do, hold them close. They are rarer than gold. Sarah and Cole became my family in the weeks that followed. They reminded me that honor doesn't live in the acceptance of others, but in the truth you carry inside. They reminded me that even when blood family fails you, chosen family can rise up to hold you steady. And yet, even with their support, the wound remained. I couldn't shake the image of that dining table, of Oliver's smirk, of the silence that followed. It pressed against me in quiet hours, in the way Evelyn's voice echoed in my memory, in the way laughter had felt like bullets. I knew this wasn't over, because betrayal is not the end of a story. It's the beginning of one. Stay with me. Because in the next part, I'll show you how that wound, raw and searing, began to transform into resolve. And how Sarah's wisdom and Cole's defiance would push me to stand not just for myself, but for every service member whose honor had ever been questioned. Sarah's kitchen became my refuge. The walls were lined with children's drawings, stick figures in uniforms, houses with flags, suns that shone brighter than reality. There was a warmth there that no mansion could match. I found myself spending long evenings at her table, sipping coffee from chipped mugs while she listened with that unflinching patience born of grief. One night, after I had recounted the story of the crushed medal for what felt like the 100th time, she leaned forward, her eyes steady. "Maya, you can let them define you or you can define yourself. Which will it be?" The question landed like a stone in my chest. Isn't it strange how sometimes the simplest words carry the most weight? I thought of the Hale family, of their glittering chandeliers and cruel laughter, of Oliver's shoe grinding down not just on bronze, but on everything it represented. And I thought of myself, standing frozen, silent, until the fury burned too hot to ignore. How many of you listening know what it's like to feel erased in a room full of people? To feel your worth dismissed by those who have never walked a day in your boots? If you've been there, then you understand why Sarah's words mattered. Because in them, I heard a challenge to reclaim the story before it consumed me. Cole's voice echoed too. He had a way of speaking that cut through noise. One afternoon, as we walked near the pier, I confessed to him that I kept replaying the dinner, wishing I had done more, said more. He stopped, turned to me, and lifted his prosthetic arm. The metal gleamed in the fading light. "You see this?" he asked. "This is what happens when life tries to take something from you. You can stare at what you lost, or you can use what's left to fight harder. Don't waste time regretting what you didn't say, Maya. Spend your time choosing what you will say next." I carried those words home with me. They haunted me in the best way, pushing me to stand taller, to remember that silence was not my ally. It was around then that I began to write. Late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, I filled notebooks with memories of deployments, of faces I'd never forget, of the promise I made under that flag. At first it was therapy, an attempt to bleed the wound dry. But slowly it became something else. It became a record, a shield, a reminder that my story mattered, even if the Hales never acknowledged it. Sometimes I wonder, do you write your own battles down? Do you keep journals, letters, notes, anything that helps you remember who you are when the world tries to tell you otherwise? If not, maybe you should, because words once written have a way of anchoring us when storms rise. The wound, though, was still tender. I felt it when Daniel and I argued. He would tell me he loved me, that his family didn't matter, that I shouldn't let them get to me. But how could I not? Love is not just whispered in the dark. Love is shown in the daylight, when others watch, when it costs you something. His silence at that table was a crack between us, one I didn't know how to seal. I tried to forgive, but forgiveness is a process, not a moment. And in the meantime, I leaned harder on Sarah and Cole. Together, they became the pillars holding me upright. Sarah with her gentle reminders that grief can carve out space for strength. Cole with his relentless insistence that dignity is not granted, it is lived. One evening, Sarah invited me to a gathering at the VFW hall. The place smelled of old wood and stories. Veterans of every branch filled the room, men and women scarred, limping, laughing, remembering. I stood at the back, listening, and felt something I hadn't in months, belonging. These people knew without asking. They didn't care about last names or fortunes. They cared about service, about sacrifice, about the invisible threads that tied us together. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. My voice cracked as I told them about the dinner, about the medal, about the laughter that cut deeper than any wound in battle. And then something happened I didn't expect, silence. Not mocking silence, not dismissal. A heavy, respectful silence. Then nods, murmurs, the quiet solidarity of those who understood. An older veteran, his cane tapping against the floor, looked me in the eye and said, "Don't ever let them take your story, sailor. That's yours. That's your honor." I left the hall with tears burning my eyes, but also with a new strength in my step. Because I realized something crucial: honor wasn't something fragile that could be crushed under a shoe. It was something that lived inside, unshakable, untouchable. And yet the wound remained, because wounds don't vanish the moment you name them. They take time. They leave scars. But scars, I was learning, were not signs of weakness. They were proof of survival. As I look back now, I see chapter 2 of my journey not as the story of my pain, but as the story of my healing. Sarah and Cole taught me that family is not always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the ones who show up when no one else does. And the veterans in that hall reminded me that even when society forgets, we do not forget each other. Maybe you've been carrying a wound like mine. Maybe someone you trusted cut you deep, and you've wondered if you'd ever heal. If so, hear me now, you can, you will, because wounds are not the end. They are the beginning of resilience, and what lay ahead for me was proof of that. The Hales had not finished their game. Their schemes would grow darker, their tactics sharper. But I was no longer the woman who sat silent with rage burning in her chest. I was gathering strength, gathering allies, gathering truth. What came next was not surrender. It was resistance, and the spark had already been lit. I should have known the Hales wouldn't let it end with a shoe grinding a metal into the floor. Families like theirs never settle for silence. They need to win, to dominate, to control the narrative. What happened at that dinner table wasn't the conclusion of a petty feud. It was only the prologue. The first sign came in an envelope. Thick cream paper, the kind that smells of ink and money, left on our doorstep without a return address. Inside was a typed document, legal language dripping like poison. It was a statement, one they wanted my signature on. It declared that I, Maya Collins Hale, had full knowledge of an unfortunate discrepancy in Hale Enterprises' overseas accounts, and that I had seen Daniel's father act only in the best interest of investors. In other words, they wanted me to lie. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper, my coffee cooling untouched beside me. My hands trembled, not from fear but from fury. They wanted me to betray everything I had ever sworn to uphold. They wanted me to sign away my honor to preserve theirs. I whispered aloud, as if reminding myself, I swore to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And suddenly, the meaning struck deeper. Domestic didn't just mean within our borders. It meant within our homes, our families, even our marriages. What would you have done in my place? Would you have signed, reasoning it was only paper, that it would keep peace and buy silence? Or would you have torn it to pieces the way I did, watching the fragments scatter across the floor like ashes? When Daniel came home that evening, I showed him what they'd sent. His face drained of color, his jaw clenching so hard I thought it might break. They never should have dragged you into this, he muttered. But when I pressed him, when I asked if he would stand against them, he looked away. That look told me everything. He loved me, yes, but he feared them more. And that, in its own way, was another betrayal. The weeks that followed felt like walking through quicksand. Whispers began circling around the base. Fellow sailors, people who once greeted me with respect, started offering sideways glances. A chief I admired asked cautiously if everything was okay at home. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The Hales were spreading rumors. According to their story, I had married Daniel for money, for status. My uniform, they said, was nothing more than a costume I wore to make myself look important. The medal I carried, they claimed it was exaggerated, its story inflated, perhaps even fabricated. Lies spread faster than truth. You know this, don't you? Once the seed of doubt is planted, it grows wild, choking out what's real. I could feel the shift in the air around me. The respect I had earned over years at sea, the credibility I had built through sweat and scars, all of it now balanced on the fragile edge of gossip. At night, I sat in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, staring at the wall. Sometimes I wanted to scream. Sometimes I wanted to march into their mansion, slam my medal down, and demand they say to my face what they whispered behind my back. But then I remembered Cole's words, "Don't waste time regretting what you didn't say. Decide what you will say next." So I made a decision. If the Hales wanted war, I would give them one. But not their kind of war, fought with wealth and whispers. I would fight with truth. I bought a small voice recorder, discreet enough to slip into a pocket. I began attending every family meeting Daniel dragged me to. I smiled, nodded, played the dutiful wife while Evelyn Hale laid out strategies to manage appearances and Oliver joked about how easy it was to spin a story. Behind my calm face, the recorder captured it all, their arrogance, their corruption, their schemes. The first time I played it back alone in my car, my hands shook, not from fear, from validation. Their voices filled the air, proof that I wasn't imagining it, proof that their cruelty wasn't some shadow in my mind. Friends, have you ever had that moment when you finally held the evidence in your hand? When the thing they told you didn't exist was suddenly undeniable? That rush of clarity, of strength, it's like fire in your veins. But I also knew the risk. If they discovered what I was doing, the storm they unleashed would be even greater. Still, I told myself, storms don't scare sailors. We're built for them. Each recording became a piece of armor. Each whispered insult, each careless confession, each sneer about my place in the family, it all became part of a growing arsenal. I wasn't just surviving their attacks anymore. I was preparing for the day I'd strike back. And in the quiet, when doubt gnawed at me, I returned to Sarah and Cole. Sarah reminded me gently that truth has its own gravity, that eventually lies collapse under their own weight. Cole, with his blunt certainty, grinned and said, "When this blows open, you better be ready to stand tall, Collins, because honor doesn't whisper, it roars." They were right. And as much as I feared what was coming, I also felt something new rising inside me. Resolve. Because the Hales could take their money, their power, their influence, and try to bury me. But I had something they couldn't touch. I had the truth. And I was done being silent. The question wasn't if I would fight back. The question was when. The rumors grew legs. They walked into places I had once felt safe, marched across the base where I had earned every ounce of respect, and whispered into ears that once trusted me. I could feel the shift, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, glances that lingered a little too long, laughter that carried a new edge. Have you ever felt the ground tilt beneath your feet, as if the world you built brick by brick was suddenly sliding away? That was how it felt to me, not because I doubted who I was, but because lies are like smoke, they choke even those who know the truth. Evelyn Hale was clever. She never said the words herself, not directly. But she planted seeds in her circle, friends at charity luncheons, whispers to church acquaintances, murmurs at political fundraisers. Soon the story spread. Maya Collins had trapped Daniel into marriage. She had used her uniform as a costume, a way to play hero. She was unstable, unfit, unworthy. And Daniel, he stayed silent. He told me at home, "I know none of it's true. You know I love you." But love without action is only air, and air does not hold up walls when storms rage. One night I sat alone in my car outside the base, the recorder heavy in my pocket. I replayed Evelyn's voice from a dinner 2 nights earlier. As long as she keeps quiet, this will blow over. She knows her place, or she'll learn it. My hands tightened on the wheel. Quiet, that was what they wanted. A compliant wife, a muted soldier, a woman who bowed her head. But I had not sworn an oath to live in silence. That night, instead of driving home, I drove to Sarah's. She opened the door in her robe, her hair pulled back, and without a word she led me inside. I played the recording for her, Evelyn's polished cruelty spilling out into the kitchen. Sarah listened, her jaw tightening. When the recording ended, she looked at me, her eyes fierce. "This is your weapon, Maya, don't hide it. When the time comes, this will be the blade that cuts through their lies." Her words burned into me. Cole, too, pushed me forward. Over beers at the VFW, he slapped the recorder on the table and said, "They think they are untouchable, but pride always talks too much. You keep catching it 1 word at a time, and when you've got enough, you bring it all down." His certainty steadied me. Still, the days were hard. Isolation weighs heavy. There were mornings I stared at the mirror, my uniform pressed crisp, my hair tight in a bun, and wondered if anyone still saw me as the sailor who once pulled men from fire. Or had I become only the caricature Evelyn painted, a woman desperate for money and status, clinging to borrowed honor? Maybe you've asked yourself the same in your darkest hours. Am I what they say I am? Or am I still the person I know inside? That battle between inner truth and outer lies can break a soul, but it can also forge it. Every rumor, every look, every whispered slight, I added them to the fire inside me. And with each recording I captured, the fire grew hotter, steadier. The breaking point came one evening at a formal gala. I hadn't wanted to go, but Daniel insisted. "It'll be easier if you show your face. Prove them wrong," he said. I put on the black dress hanging in my closet, pinned my medal carefully to my chest, scarred though it was, and walked into the ballroom with my head high. The chandeliers glittered, the music swelled, and yet the air was thick with disdain. Evelyn approached, her pearls gleaming, her smile sharp. She leaned close enough for only me to hear. "You could make this so much easier if you just sign. We protect our own, Maya, but you'll never be one of us unless you do." I smiled back, my heart pounding, the recorder tucked discreetly in my clutch. "I already know who I am," I whispered. She pulled back, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't press further. She didn't have to, because I had captured enough, her words, their schemes, the proof that honor wasn't mine to surrender. That night, when I got home, I sat in the dark and listened to the recordings stacked one after another. The web of lies, the arrogance, the corruption, it was all there. For the first time in months, I felt the weight shift. Not off my shoulders, not yet, but I could see the path forward. And I'll tell you this, there is nothing more powerful than the moment you realize the truth you carry is stronger than the lies that surround you. I didn't know when or how I would use what I had gathered. But I knew this. Silence was no longer an option. This wasn't about a crushed medal anymore. It wasn't even just about me. It was about every sailor who'd ever been mocked, every woman whose service was belittled, every soldier whose honor was questioned. I carried their voices with mine, and I would not let them be erased. So I kept recording, kept smiling in their presence, nodding, playing the part they thought I would play. All the while, I was building my case, brick by brick, word by word. And somewhere in the quiet of those nights, when I sat alone with the recorder and the shadows of their voices filled the room, I felt something settle inside me. Resolve. The Hales thought they were writing my story. But what they didn't realize was this: I was writing theirs. And when the time came, the truth would roar louder than their lies ever could. The storm was coming, and I was ready to face it. The night of the gala smelled of perfume and polished brass, of expensive wine poured into crystal glasses, of wealth pretending to be purity. The Hale family had spared no detail. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the walls draped in velvet, the stage adorned with banners proclaiming a future of integrity. Integrity, how the word mocked me from above the dais. This wasn't just a fundraiser. It was theater, a carefully staged performance where Evelyn Hale would shine as the benevolent matriarch, her family arrayed around her like ornaments, while I, if they had their way, would be exposed as an unworthy pretender. I stood near the back, my gown simple compared to the shimmer of sequins and silk around me. My medal rested against my chest, scarred but unbowed. My recorder and files were tucked into my clutch, their weight heavier than gold, because inside that small bag wasn't just evidence. It was my voice, my shield, my weapon. Have you ever walked into a room knowing you were the target? That every whispered laugh, every sideways glance was a dart aimed at you? If you have, then you know how steady you must stand, how much courage it takes to plant your feet when the ground trembles beneath you. Evelyn moved through the crowd like a queen greeting her subjects. Oliver trailed close behind, his smirk never far from his lips. I caught fragments of their words as they passed. So tragic, really such a burden for Daniel. She won't last much longer in his world. The cruelty was sugar-coated, but cruelty all the same. When Evelyn finally stepped onto the stage, the room hushed. She spoke with practiced ease, weaving stories of Hale Enterprises' legacy, their commitment to community, their unshakable values. People applauded, glasses clinked, and for a moment, I could almost believe she had won. Almost. Then her voice shifted, smooth as silk, sharp as a blade. But integrity, she said, is sometimes tested. Sometimes people enter our lives who do not share our values, and it falls to us to protect what we've built. Her eyes found mine across the room, holding for just a second too long. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, subtle knowing. It was the strike I had expected, the public humiliation, the moment they hoped would break me. My pulse hammered, but I kept my chin high. I was ready to step forward, to open my clutch and let their own words condemn them. But before I could move, a sound cut through the room, the distinct, measured cadence of boots against marble. Every head turned. Daniel. He wore his dress uniform, the medals on his chest gleaming under the chandeliers, his cap tucked beneath his arm. His face was hard, resolute, the face of the man I had hoped to see so many times before. In that instant, I didn't know what side he had chosen. But as he crossed the room and took his place at my side, I saw it in his eyes. This time he would not be silent. The air shifted. People murmured, uneasy. Evelyn faltered for the first time, her words caught mid-sentence. Daniel's voice rang out steady, carrying over the crowd. "My wife," he said, "has given more to this country than anyone in this room combined, and tonight the truth will be heard." A hush fell, heavy as a curtain. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, and drew the recorder from my clutch. My hand didn't shake. For weeks I had carried their venom in secret. Tonight I would let it spill into the light. I pressed play. Evelyn's voice filled the hall. "As long as she keeps quiet, this will blow over. She knows her place, or she'll learn it." Gasps rippled. Oliver's laughter followed, sneering. "She's just a sailor, not really Hale material, is she?" Then Evelyn again. "If she signs the statement, we protect her. If she doesn't, well, people believe what we tell them." The room stilled. I let the words play out, one after another, each recording a stone shattering the glass facade they had built. Have you ever witnessed a room shift in an instant? The way admiration drains from faces, replaced by shock, by betrayal, by shame. That's what I saw then. People who had smiled at Evelyn minutes earlier now stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. When the last recording ended, the silence was suffocating. My own breath sounded loud in my ears. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice hard with conviction. "You wanted to speak of integrity, Mother. Integrity isn't inherited, it's earned. And tonight Maya has shown more honor than this family ever has." It was the first time he had stood openly against them. And in that moment, I forgave the silences, the hesitation, the fear, because finally he chose. Evelyn's face was pale, her pearls trembling against her throat. Oliver's smirk had vanished, replaced by fury. Their empire, so carefully constructed, was crumbling in front of their friends, their allies, their benefactors. And I felt no triumph, only clarity. Because this was never about revenge. It was about truth. About proving that honor cannot be bought, cannot be silenced, cannot be crushed beneath a shoe. But the night wasn't over. The real reckoning had only begun. The silence after the last recording ended was heavier than any storm I had ever stood in. It pressed down on the crowd, thick and suffocating like a fog rolling in from the sea. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were on Evelyn and Oliver, once untouchable, now exposed under the glare of their own arrogance. I could almost hear the weight of their empire cracking. The applause of socialites, The nods of investors, the trust of politicians, every bit of it evaporated in that instant. It struck me how fragile power is when it's built on lies. And then the whispers began, not toward me, but toward them. I caught fragments drifting through the room. Unbelievable! So this is who they really are. All this time, their friends, their allies, their admirers, turning in real time. Have you ever witnessed the fall of someone who thought they were invincible? The way a single truth, once spoken aloud, has the power to dismantle years of deceit. It's both devastating and liberating. Evelyn tried to recover. She stepped forward, her hand raised, her voice reaching for the authority she once commanded. These recordings are taken out of context. My son's wife, she's clearly unstable But Daniel cut her off. His voice was firm, louder than hers, filled with the authority of his uniform. Enough! The word cracked through the air like a gunshot. Don't you dare call her unstable. Don't you dare undermine her service, her sacrifice. She has stood for this country in ways none of you ever have. The gasp that moved through the audience was not just for me, it was for him, for the son who had finally broken free from his family's grip. I stood straighter, my hand still on the recorder. The truth doesn't need context, I said quietly, but the microphone carried it across the hall. The truth stands on its own. Somewhere in the back, applause started, hesitant at first, then stronger. Soon the sound filled the room, drowning Evelyn's protests, rising like a tide. And for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't dared hope for, vindication. But with it came something else. Grief. Because standing there, I realized I had lost more than just peace. I had lost the chance at belonging in the family I had married into. No matter what happened next, that dream was ash. Sometimes victory feels like loss, doesn't it? Sometimes telling the truth means burning bridges you once prayed would hold. Daniel reached for my hand, his grip steady. "We're leaving," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. He didn't ask. He didn't glance back at his mother. He simply led me down the aisle, past tables of stunned faces, out of the glittering ballroom and into the night. Outside, the air was cold, sharp, almost cleansing. I took a breath and felt my chest expand as if I hadn't breathed fully in months. "Why tonight?" I asked softly, turning to him. He looked at me, the hardness in his eyes softening into something I recognized. "Because tonight I saw clearly. They wanted to destroy you, Maya, and I won't be part of it. Not again, not ever." It wasn't an apology for the silences, for the hesitations, but it was a choice, and choices matter more than words. The next morning, the fallout began. Headlines spread, "Hail Family Integrity Questioned at Fundraiser." Recordings expose pressure to cover financial misconduct. Navy officer's wife brings truth to light. The story rippled outward, unstoppable. Calls flooded Hale Enterprises. Investors demanded answers. Political allies distanced themselves. For the first time in their gilded lives, the Hales were the ones shunned, whispered about, left standing in the ruins of their own making. And me, I returned to the base, my head held higher. The sideways glances vanished, replaced by nods, by quiet salutes that carried respect rather than pity. A chief who had once doubted me stopped me in the hallway, his voice low but steady. "You did right, Collins, don't forget that." That moment meant more than headlines ever could. Yet even in vindication, the scar remained. Because battles leave marks, visible or not. I had defended my honor, yes. But the cost was steep. Fractured family, sleepless nights, the constant ache of betrayal. Maybe you felt it too, that bittersweet victory, when you win the fight but lose the thing you once hoped for. If you have, then you know why I walked away from the Hale mansion that week, not triumphant, but resolute. I wasn't done, because this story was never just mine. It was about something larger, about proving that honor cannot be erased, even by wealth or power. About reminding people that silence is not survival, it's surrender. And I refuse to surrender. Daniel and I packed our things not long after. We left behind the townhouse, the parties, the poisoned dinners. We found a small place by the coast, where the air smelled of salt and freedom. And as we unpacked boxes in that quiet house, I knew the storm had passed, but the work of rebuilding had only begun. Honor had been tested, and for a moment nearly crushed. But it had not broken. And now, with the truth revealed, I carried not just my own dignity, but the weight of every service member who had ever been doubted, dismissed, or demeaned. And here's what I learned. The truth, once spoken, cannot be buried again. That night at the gala was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one where I would take the scar on my medal, the scar in my heart, and turn them into something greater than pain. The Hales had lost their empire of lies, but I had found something far more enduring. My voice, my strength, my honor. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. The headlines didn't fade quickly. For weeks, the Hales filled the news cycle, not for their charity galas or political clout, but for their downfall. Reporters dug deeper, investors pulled out, and the family name, once spoken with admiration, became a byword for hypocrisy. Evelyn and Oliver vanished from public view, retreating into the shadows of the empire they had thought unshakable. But I had no desire to follow their collapse. Truth had already done its work. The rest no longer belonged to me. What mattered was what came after, for Daniel, for me, and for the life we had yet to build. So we left. We packed our things into boxes, not of luxury, but of necessity, uniforms, photographs, a few books, the scarred metal that had once been ground into the floor. We left behind the townhouse, the glittering dinners, the whispered venom. We drove south until the air changed, until the salt of the Atlantic filled our lungs. Norfolk. The house we chose was small, paint peeling at the edges, but it had a porch that faced the sea. At night, when the tide rolled in, I could hear the water crashing against the shore, steady as a heartbeat. That sound, more than anything, reminded me of who I was. Have you ever stepped away from a world that tried to define you, only to find that in leaving, you rediscovered yourself? That was what Norfolk gave me. Not grandeur, not applause. Just space to breathe, to heal, to remember. Daniel adjusted quickly. He found work that kept him close to the base, enough to stay connected without being tethered to the expectations of his family. And for the first time since our wedding, I saw peace in his eyes. The shadow Evelyn had cast no longer stretched over him. He was free. But even freedom carries responsibility. And as the weeks passed, I realized I could not simply turn inward, licking my wounds in private. Too many women in uniform had stood where I stood, dismissed, doubted, betrayed by the very families or institutions meant to protect them. Too many had been silenced. That thought burned like a new oath. I couldn't undo what had been done to me, but I could turn it into something that mattered for others. So the idea for True North Foundation was born. We named it after the compass every sailor carries, literal or metaphorical. True North, the direction that doesn't waver, no matter the storm. The foundation would provide support for women veterans abandoned by families, struggling to rebuild lives after service, or facing the invisible wounds of betrayal. It would also extend to the families left behind, the widows, the children, the forgotten. The first meeting was small. Sarah sat at my kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug, her eyes shining with encouragement. Cole leaned back in his chair, his prosthetic hand tapping rhythm against the wood. "You've got the fire," he said, grinning. "Now give it direction." We drafted plans, scribbled ideas on napkins, made calls to people who believed in more than money. Within months, the foundation had a name, a mission, and a purpose bigger than my pain. Do you know what it feels like to transform suffering into strength? To take the wound that nearly broke you and use it as the cornerstone for something unshakable. It doesn't erase the pain, but it redeems it. The community rallied. Donations trickled in, small at first but steady. Veterans shared stories that mirrored mine, different details, same wounds. Each story reaffirmed why True North mattered. It wasn't charity, it was justice. Daniel stood beside me through it all. He didn't just lend his name, he lent his presence, his hands, his belief. We had been tested by fire, nearly consumed, but now we were building something no scandal could destroy. And through it all, the medal remained. Scuffed, bent, but still gleaming in the light. I kept it on my desk as a reminder, not of the Hale's cruelty, but of survival. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the promise I made in uniform. And I knew someday it would serve a purpose beyond me. Because honor, I had learned, isn't a relic. It's a torch. And torches are meant to be passed on. The months passed, and True North Foundation grew roots. What began as meetings at my kitchen table evolved into an office by the harbor, its walls decorated with photographs of women in uniform, letters of thanks, and children's drawings that reminded me so much of Sarah's kitchen. Veterans came through our doors carrying wounds visible and invisible, and for the first time in a long time, I felt not only useful but whole. One evening, after a long day of intake calls and grant applications, I stood on the porch watching the sun sink into the horizon. The sky bled orange and violet, the waves catching the light in a shimmer of fire. Daniel joined me, slipping an arm around my shoulders. "You've built something real, Maya," he said softly. "Something that will outlast every scandal, every lie." His words warmed me, but my eyes lingered on the medal resting on the table behind us. Scarred, bent, and yet still gleaming in the light. I knew then what I had to do. The medal had served its purpose for me. Now it needed to serve someone else. Have you ever felt a moment of clarity so sharp it almost hurt? That evening was mine. Because I understood, honor was never meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared, passed on like a flame to keep others warm. Weeks later, I found myself standing on the parade ground of the Naval Academy, rows of white uniforms lined in perfect formation under the spring sun. Families filled the bleachers, flags rippling in the breeze. The air smelled of polished brass and anticipation. I had been invited to speak at the graduation ceremony, not as the wife of a Hale, but as a veteran, as the founder of True North. I carried the medal in my pocket, its weight both grounding and liberating. As I stepped to the podium, my heart pounded with the rhythm of every march I had ever walked. I looked out at the faces, young, hopeful, brimming with the kind of courage only beginnings hold, and I began to speak. "I stand before you not because my path has been easy, but because it has been tested. I have worn this uniform in battle, and I have worn it in the face of betrayal. I have learned that honor is not given by medals or families or the applause of crowds. Honor is lived, day by day, choice by choice." The crowd was silent, listening. My voice steadied as I continued. "There will be times when your honor is challenged, not by the enemy abroad, but by those close to you. Times when silence will seem safer than truth. In those moments, remember this, medals can be tarnished, but honor cannot, not if you choose to live it." Then I called forward a name, Ensign Rachel Torres, a young woman, barely 22, with eyes sharp as steel and hands that trembled only slightly as she saluted. She had grown up the daughter of a janitor, fought her way through school, and earned her commission with grit no one could deny. I reached into my pocket and drew out the medal. For a moment, I held it up, letting the sunlight catch the scar across its face. "This medal," I said, "once lay crushed under the heel of someone who thought honor was theirs to control. But honor doesn't break when tested. It endures. Today, I pass it to you, not as a symbol of perfection, but as a reminder. That honor is not in this medal. It's in how you live, how you serve, how you stand when the world tries to push you down." Her eyes filled with tears as I placed the medal in her hand. She whispered, "I won't forget." And in that moment, I knew my journey had come full circle. The crowd erupted in applause, but I barely heard it. What mattered was the fire I saw in Rachel's eyes, the way she straightened her shoulders as if the medal had given her not weight, but wings. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is let go, to pass on what once anchored us so it can anchor someone else. After the ceremony, Sarah hugged me tight, her voice thick. "You've turned your pain into someone else's hope. That's the truest honor there is." Cole grinned, raising his prosthetic hand in salute. "Told you, Collins, honor doesn't whisper, it roars." And today the whole damn world heard it. That night, back on the porch by the sea, I sat with Daniel watching the tide roll in. The medal was no longer mine, but I felt lighter, freer, as if by giving it away I had finally claimed its meaning. Have you ever discovered that the end of one story is really the beginning of another? That's what this felt like, because my life was no longer about defending against lies. It was about building truth, passing on strength, and ensuring no woman in uniform ever felt alone in her fight. The Hales had lost their empire of deceit, but I had gained something greater, a foundation built on resilience, community, and faith. And as the waves whispered against the shore, I knew this was my dawn. Honor had not been broken, it had been reborn. In the end, this was never just a story about a family feud or a crushed medal. It was about the resilience of the human spirit, about the way honor, once tested, proves itself unbreakable. Power and money may rise and fall, but true honor, lived in quiet choices, in sacrifice, in integrity, remains untouched. I learned that family is not defined by last names or bloodlines, but by the people who stand beside you when the world turns its back. Sarah, Cole, the veterans who opened their arms to me, they showed me that real family is made of loyalty, respect, and love. And Daniel, who finally chose truth over silence, reminded me that redemption is always possible. Most of all, I discovered that betrayal, as deep as it cuts, can become the soil where strength grows. What others meant for humiliation became the very proof of my resilience. What they tried to bury became the fire that lit my path. And maybe that's the heart of this story. That no one, no family, no institution, no power can strip you of your dignity unless you allow it. That inside every wound lies the possibility of justice, if you're willing to carry the truth forward. So if you've been listening and felt your own scars ache, know this: you are not alone. Your honor is not fragile. Your strength, though quiet, is real. And even in the face of betrayal, you have the power to rise, to reclaim, to rebuild. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you love, or of a battle you fought in silence, I invite you to stay with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join our community each week as we share stories of resilience, sacrifice, and hope. Stories that honor the women and men who have stood the line, and stories that remind us that dignity can never truly be broken. Together, we can carry these voices further. Together, we can make sure no story of courage is ever forgotten. Because honor doesn't live in medals or monuments. It lives in us, in the way we stand, in the way we fight, and in the way we love. And that is a truth no one can ever take away.